Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meetup session for project management intelligence. That's what we're calling right now. We'll talk about this in a minute about our more adjusted meetup setup, let's say. Today, we're talking about scaling Agile with intelligence. We have our guest, Jeff Nicholas, who will introduce in a minute. I will also introduce my co-host for today, Nicholas Rohrbach. Hi, Nicholas.
Marcus?
We want to first talk about a few changes with our meetup group. First, as you can realize, we are on YouTube. We want to do this as a live session and in the future, hopefully also across different channels like LinkedIn or Facebook, basically to increase our reach with our topics. We also apologize that in the past or over the last months, we're a little bit behind with our schedule in terms of our aim to have monthly meetup sessions and bring those topics to you. We hope for the better. Obviously, we had a lot to do, as you maybe can imagine. But as I said, we hope to get this running on a monthly basis going forward. Maybe Nicholas, you want to also comment on our changes in terms of the meetup group, how we plan this going forward.
Yeah, I guess, from our perspective, we had a lot of kind of conversations, discussion about this, and we really want to kind of make it interactive in a sense and accessible through different platforms, and also make it interesting for kind of the community where it's more talking to kind of industry leaders, getting feedback, I guess maybe making a little bit podcasty type in a sense, but also providing the insight and just having it on different channels as well. I think that's a bit.
Right. We don't want to keep you waiting here. We want to dive right into the topic. We have 1 hour today, and as we obviously want to talk also to our guests today. Just a few points about the logistics here. So we're obviously not on Zoom, but we still want to have some form of engagement from your end, from the audience, and that we do by using Mentimeter, as we have done already in the past. So we will have some questions, come to this in a minute. And also, if you have any questions along the way, just feel free to put it into the chat box on YouTube, and we will try to get them addressed right away as it suits. Just feel free to ask your questions whenever something pops up into your mind. So, as I said, Mentimeter survey. So first, let me just change this. We want to have some idea about where you're actually from. Maybe you can type that in. You may be familiar already with Mentimeter. So it says here at the bottom, menti.com. If you could navigate to that website and use that code that's written here, 16413708. We would be interested to hear from you where you're actually dialing in from today. In the past, we had quite some international audience, so it's always interesting to get an understanding where you're all dialing in from. I hope that's working today. Oh, Zurich, okay, that's obviously a classic. That's where we're also, Canada, okay, that's great. So we have, looks like we are getting international here, really, again. Pittsburgh, USA. Germany. Germany, exactly, because as you may are familiar, we advertise our meetup on meetup.com, that platform, but also on the Zing platform, which is quite popular in Germany. So it's no surprise that we're also getting some attendees from Germany. Singapore, all right. England, great. So yeah, again, we are quite international. That's great. That's good news. Uh, I will just move on. I just have a different question to you. And as you realized, our question today is about Agile, specifically Agile at scale. And to get this, basically also get some background from your end or where you're coming from in terms of project management and the methodologies, would like to understand a little bit more from your end. What are you actually using? Are you actually using Agile at scale or scaled Agile or Agile approach or even traditional or hybrid approach, right? That would be interesting as it maybe also leads to some further questions or discussions thereafter. Okay, Agile, hybrid seems to become also more and more popular. Oh yeah, hybrid approach. So we have more people actually operating in a hybrid approach. Okay, I mean, I don't want to keep you waiting, as I said, but it's quite interesting. So scaled Agile, obviously, at least from the ones who responded here, nobody using this, so it might be interesting to even to understand from you what Agile at scale, how it is, I mean, how it works, and what it means, what it implies, and that's where our guest will basically give us some overview and some context. So I would like to introduce our guest for today, Jeff Nicholas from Boston Consulting Group. And maybe, I mean, I will hand it over right to you. Maybe you can introduce yourself, Jeff, and give some background on your experience, especially when it comes to Agile at scale. That would be quite interesting. Thanks.
Sure, super. Thank you very much, Marcus. So very briefly about me, I've been at this for over 25 years. A lot of experience in financial industry and payments, FI-related fintech type of organizations, and for the past couple of years only in consulting. My roles have primarily been as a technology leader, but I've also had the role of product owner in a startup. I've been in a .com. I've been an architect as well as a developer as well as a tester. So all across the gamut. And I started working in Agile in the mid 2000s when I joined a .com. That's where I learned Agile, and since then brought it to a couple of organizations that I work with, a couple of banks, and then now in my current role working with financial institutions as well as software companies, insurance companies, manufacturing organizations, all sorts of different ways to help organizations work better, essentially, deliver faster, deliver higher quality, deliver better value to customers through Agile ways of working.
Thanks, Jeff. So good to have you here. I'm sure there will be several questions coming also from our audience. As we have seen, Agile at scale seems to be something that's, at least from this audience today, not fully used yet. And yeah, maybe you can give us some intro on Agile at scale and what it actually implies. What is it actually?
Yep. So Agile at scale is a framework for going from a few teams working in Agile to having the whole organization work in Agile. And I would say, while it's not easy, and I don't want to downplay the effort to get a team working, in a cross-functional team working using Agile and sprinting consistently, every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever your rhythm is, and delivering in a good, consistent way. While that's not easy, it's relatively easy compared to getting the whole organization to really support that. And when I say that, it's like once you get those teams working and they're delivering on a regular basis, and I've seen this with my, the dev teams that I worked with, particularly in Singapore, in the roles I was in, the teams get going to they're firing on all cylinders, and then they hit up against the organizational constraints where the organization is holding them back through any variety of different things. And so one of the things that we do in BCG when we're trying to help organizations to kind of go beyond that tipping point of we've got some teams working in Agile, it's working nicely, but we don't have the full support of the organization, is we start looking at, well, what are your governance processes? What are your funding processes? Are they supporting your Agile ways of working? Are they supporting stable, long-lived teams, which is one of the kind of tenets of a well-functioning Agile teaming system? Is your HR process supporting working in Agile teams? Do you have a career ladder? If you're talking in technology, do you have a career ladder that supports the engineers and the testers and those sorts of people to be able to grow within the organization the same way that business folks in the business side of the organization might be able to do? So those are the kinds of aspects that we're going to address when we're looking at scaling Agile to really get the whole organization behind the Agile ways of working.
And Jeff, I mean, if you compare it to kind of traditional methodologies, what do you think are the biggest differences or the differentiators, let's say?
Yeah. So I think that in our scaling approach, we don't really worry about whether you're going to use Scrum or Kanban or Lean, right? That's fine, right? We're not fussed about how the teams work actually on the ground. And most of our clients will use a mixture of methods that are appropriate to the team that they're working with, or the team and the team's goals. Where our approach differs from other scaling approaches is the kind of completeness of the approach. And where it differs from traditional approaches is that the traditional approach is going to leave you with this gap between what you're asking people to do and how fast you're asking them to work, and the tools and that you're giving them, the tools in terms of processes and support and things like that to actually make that happen.
Okay. And you brought up the point of tools. Like, I mean, let's say within the organizations, I mean, what kind of tooling do these organizations generally rely on to actually become a scaled organization?
So, to become a scaled organization, I mean, if you're talking about technology tools, I mean, there are technology tools that we use when we're working together. So Jira is a very common tool used across most of the organizations I've worked with. There's Trello, right, which is now owned by Jira. Those are very common. I've seen some companies using Miro or Mural, which is a very nice whiteboarding system kind of thing, virtual, especially in the last year and a half, where teams can't physically come together. This has been a really nice tool to allow teams to collaborate with each other. But that's much more on the teaming side of things. When you start talking about the scaling side, I don't think there's any one particular tool that helps you to scale more than another one. There are just a variety of processes and structural changes that you have to put in place, HR changes you have to put in place that allow you to really work in a scaled way. That said, many of these other tools can help you when you're doing, for example, the planning part of things, especially in a virtual environment, doing planning virtually in a large organization where you have to get, 150 people potentially, working in the same direction. I mean, these online tools are going to become invaluable to you.
Okay.
So Jeff,
let's not forget Zoom as well, or Microsoft Teams, or something like that to allow this kind of face-to-face communication.
Slack
Right.
and stuff.
So, Jeff, I have a question actually, especially when it comes to tools. Because as far as I know, I'm in Agile at scale that implies some, from a decision-making approach, some decentralization, right? And we all know that, everything became more complex, there's a higher information flow, and we talk a lot about data and data analytics, etc., because of making sense of this massive flow of data, right? So my question is, because with an agile at scale setup, there could be some new challenge coming its way in terms of this consistency with the tools, right, that we are using. So especially when it comes to decision making, if it's decentralized, and then we have to apply tools to basically fetch information, etc., and that's not consistent. How wouldn't that cause, in your view, also some challenges in terms of alignment between teams in an agile setup?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things that we work with organizations a lot on is about there's two kinds of alignment. Let's say there's the top-down alignment where senior leaders should be setting very clear purpose, strategy, and priorities and communicating that down to every person in the organization. So, and we'll take this question maybe in two ways. So one part is making sure that in this decentralized organization where you have decision making happening on the ground, not necessarily up at the senior management level, but on the ground in teams, the people in those teams need to know what the purpose and the strategy of the organization is so that they can make the right kinds of decisions, right? So that's one really important aspect. And there's no special tooling required for that. That's just really about communication and over communicating and making sure that everyone understands why we're here, what we're trying to accomplish, and setting goals, right? Setting clear outcome-oriented goals. We want to move the needle on our click-through rate. We want to move the needle on the time it takes to onboard a new customer. So whatever those goals are, those have to be really clear to the teams, right? So that's one piece. Then, when you actually get to the planning part, we use a tool or a mechanism that to do a quarterly business review that ensures that the people in the teams are aligned with the goals of the organization, the goals of the division or the department. But then at the end of that, you have all these teams that think they know what they're going to do and how they're going to deliver to meet these goals. And we get them together in one big room, virtual or otherwise, to do what we call big room planning. And the big room planning exercise is a crucial step in making sure that everyone understands where the touch points are, the dependencies are between the different teams, right? And that those teams are reprioritizing then. If I need an API from your team, then I need to make sure that you understand that I need that API to deliver on the functionality that I'm building. And we then align on how that's going to work. I don't want to characterize it as it's not a waterfall. It's not somebody dictating that, oh, you have to do this and then I'm going to do that. But there's still dependencies, right? And dependency management is real, and it's a problem in an agile organization as well as in any other kind of organization. The difference is in an agile organization, rather than me as a developer telling a project manager and that project manager going and talking to some other project manager and talking to some other team, and so I'm passing my responsibility to a middle person. I'm taking responsibility as a developer to talk to the developer in the other team and make sure that he or she understands what the needs of my team are, right? And it's empowering people to have those conversations and requiring people to have those conversations. That really helps to break down a lot of barriers and eliminate a lot of misunderstanding.
Right. No, understood. Okay, thanks. But one further question. is because you mentioned, right, you bring people into one big room, right, iteration planning, etc. And obviously, just like in any other methodology or in any project, basically, we do some performance tracking, right, how we're actually progressing, right? So coming back to what I said earlier, right, in terms of this overflow of data and information and decision-making practices as well. And we want, obviously, to make that switch to a more innovative approach with data analytics and AI at the end. But what kind of, in an agile at scale setup, what kind of performance metrics are you using or would you use going forward, having in mind the current complexity and uncertainty in projects in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic question, really. How do you measure productivity of a software developer, right?
Yeah.
And clearly, it is not lines of code, we've kind of all figured that out by now, right? It wasn't that way when I started necessarily, but yeah, good on us. There were really three metrics that we look at, and two of them, looking at the big picture, I really only need two metrics to understand how well a team is doing. It's cycle time and production defect rate. So the cycle time is there to tell me how fast the team is able to take a requirement and put it into production. That's the basic thing. Now, is that requirement big or small? I don't care. From an overall leadership point of view, actually, the smaller the requirement, the better, right? But if I can take a requirement from a product owner and build, test, and put that into production, then that is a key metric of the performance of the team. But if I do that at poor quality, then I'm going to have a lot of production problems. So then I have to look at production defects, because what I want to see is I want to see a very low cycle time, but I also want to see a low number of production defects, right? And so if I can keep, the lower I can keep both those numbers, the better that team is performing overall. Now, I said there were three metrics, so there's one more that we need to bring into the mix, because those two numbers are only going to tell me the story today. What I need to know about tomorrow and next month and next year is code quality, right? And so we've actually developed a code quality index. It's looking at a number of different measures using static code analysis, like SonarQube, for example, and we create an index out of that. It's a weighted index, so that if you look, for example, at SonarQube, you've got letter grades across these different ways that it measures code, and what we do is we weight an A higher than, and there's a big gap if you get a B in something, and then there's an even start, if you get a C or a D or an F, there's an even sharper drop off. That way, we want to make sure that you're going to be, getting people that are in the B and A range, and that the C's and D's and F's aren't kind of squeaking by, right? You don't want those people to squeak by with that poor quality. So that's really your long-term measure. So in cycle time and production defect rate, that's today, how things are doing. Code quality, how is my code going to be in the long run? With those three metrics, you can really understand how well your teams are doing overall. So that's, for me as a manager, as a leader, understanding how teams are doing. For the teams themselves, of course, they should be looking at those metrics as well, but they should then be looking at other metrics, right? Whatever's important for them. It might be UAT defects, right? So my production defect rate is high. Well, let's look at my UAT defect rate, and then maybe even down the pipe. There's a recycle rate. So if I, as a developer, if my code is going to you as a product owner, and you're kicking it back, and then I go to you again, and you kick it back, and I go to again, you kick it back, then I'm maybe not doing something right, or we're misunderstanding each other, right? Potentially, right? Or maybe it's just a really nice tight cycle, and we have a good dialogue through the working product. So that's why you don't want these things to be something that senior leaders are looking at, because they might not be able to interpret that, but it's for the team to look at. Is that something interesting for us where we can improve how we work based on these metrics, right? And of course, there's velocity and burn down rate, and standard agile metrics like that as well.
And when it comes to, I mean, I understand obviously this kind of metrics and this approach has been developed over time, but I mean also the environments are changing, and as I said before, like complexity increases and uncertainty. I mean, how do you see that in terms of what can be improved in this whole setup right now in terms of tracking performance, etc.? Do you see actually room for improvement, and see you some specific measures that could be applied?
I mean, data capture is always a problem, right? So even if you're using a system like Jira, it's not going to tell you the whole story, right? If you take the things I talked about, you've got one part of the story in Jira. You've got the, Jira doesn't necessarily know when you put something in production. That might be in another system like Snow or something like that. Your production incidents are typically not going to be tracked there. Again, that's probably going to be in Snow or a system like that. Your code quality is going to be in yet another system. So pulling all of this data together, just from those operational metrics, it's not going to be in one place. And then when you want to talk about more business metrics, right? If you want to look at things like in a classic web e-commerce company, you care about your click-through rate, you care about your the number of sessions that you've had, you care about shopping cart abandonment. So those are all going to be in different parts of the organization as well. So bringing that data together to be able to get a complete picture of not only how fast the team is delivering, the quality of what the team is delivering, the long-term viability of the code, and then the impact of that code. That is the outcomes that you're creating, which ultimately, that's the only thing that matters, is the outcomes that we're creating. Are we building satisfied customers? Right? Am I using an NPS, Net Promoter Score, to track whether my customers are happy or not, or some other mechanism? And do I see the business metrics moving in the right direction? Do I see my click-through rate going up? Do I see the number of sessions? And maybe if I'm in the e-com company that I was in, we cared about the number of page views per session. Do I see that going up or down? Those kinds of things, right? So bringing all those metrics together is an issue, right? And it's depending on the complexity of the company, it can be an extremely difficult issue to crack.
Right. Okay, we have a question from the audience, which I maybe can show. Sorry.
So it says, on cycle time, did you mean time from backlog generated to the release of that includes this backlog? If so, just change. If so, how a backlog issue got prioritized has nothing to do with the performance tracking. Yeah, so this is a really great question, right? And I would put it maybe a little bit differently. The question kind of boils down to, when do you start the clock ticking, right? When you want to track cycle time. I mean, the end time is pretty clear because that is when you've put the thing into production, right? But when you start the clock ticking is something that we've wrestled with a little bit. I would say you should normally start that. I would say you start that when the team picks up the story in that sprint, assuming you're using a Scrum kind of a what do you call it? Scrum kind of a model, right? If you're using Kanban, then it's once it gets into the work in progress queue, right? That's probably when you should start tracking. There is one school of thought that says you start that from the time of when did you have the idea. So from idea to implementation. There's two problems with that. One is you should be having a lot of ideas, many of which then fall out of your backlog, right? Because or they just stay in your backlog, but you never work on them. And so just because you had an idea 2 years ago and you deprioritized it because you had many other better ideas in front of that, and then you decide to do it, that shouldn't penalize the team and their cycle time, right? It doesn't make sense. So really, from a practical point of view, to measure the team's ability to deliver, you want to see when does the team pick it up and when does the team then put it into production.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers my question.
Yeah, I hope so. Otherwise, we hopefully we have some time later on to follow up on something. I just would like to switch over to another Mentimeter question, talking about challenges, etc., what we have discussed before. And I will just move on here to the audience. And the question is, where do you see the biggest challenges when scaling Agile? And I realize, I mean, in the previous question, there were not really responses in terms of scaled Agile being used as a methodology by this audience here. But probably based on the discussion so far, there might be some idea already. Okay, that looks a little bit strange right now. That seems to be some. Oh yeah, okay, right now. I was looking for the labels. I didn't see it. Okay, so organizational culture, planning complexity. Let's give it a few seconds for others to respond as well. So it looks like the cultural part seems to be some kind of, if I understood you correctly, Jeff, that kind of lines up with what you were saying before, right? In terms of cultural pieces and that alignment that needs to be done in terms of a scaled Agile approach, right? Which is most relevant probably.
Yeah, culture is definitely a big issue. It's a major thing to address. It's a major item to address in any Agile scale transformation. A lot of the organizations let's say, prior to being a consultant, the organizations that I worked in, the financial industry organizations, banks that I worked for, especially in terms of engineering culture, they didn't have a strong engineering culture. And if you compare them to .coms, whether it's the one that I worked at or a Google or a Facebook or something like that, it's a very, very different kind of culture. And so this is one of the things that we work in the organizations we work with that we try to focus on, and we work with leaders a lot on this because the culture of the organization, although it's important, it's really critical to address. It's a dial that you can't actually adjust directly, right? You can work on processes, you can work on governance, you can work on funding and HR and leadership behaviors, right? You can and all of these things you can directly address. You can work on how you measure and the kind of technology enablers that you bring into the organization. But culture is this intangible sum of all of these things that is so critical, but not something that you can just go in and say, I'm going to do this and change my culture, and suddenly we're going to be a cool and hip engineering. No, that takes time, it takes effort, it takes consistency. So it's absolutely one of the major factors that we have to address, but we have to address it through all of these other things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what I find interesting is actually in terms of the challenges here, the planning complexity, because my personal view is that, I mean, not only Agile, but in general, project management, the planning part is kind of, it becomes kind of the biggest challenge, right? Because it comes back to what I said before in terms of information overflow, people are obviously biased, and then when we link that to Agile approach, the Agile at scale, with what you mentioned, like bringing all teams into a room, that makes this whole thing more complex. At least that's my perception, right? And that's where I personally would see like the planning complexity is kind of increasing, and this way also becoming a bigger challenge. Would you share this view? I mean, obviously the culture, you answered that already, is one of the bigger elements, but do you see the planning part also as or becoming more challenging?
The planning is certainly more challenging. More compared to what? The planning is certainly challenging. I would say the best, most effective way I've seen this being addressed is in the organization I was in, the team I was in one of the teams I was in Singapore, where we would literally do big room planning in a big room where every team had its quarterly roadmap of kind of epics and stories up on the wall, and every team member could go around and look at the different stories and see where there were, potential dependencies to their team. And so you were kind of crowdsourcing this interaction by being able to look physically at all of these cards, physical cards up on the wall. That was a really amazing experience, and a very effective way to get every team member involved in the dependency management. Barring that, especially now in the virtual world that we're living in most cases, that's where a tool like a Miro or Mural or something like that can be a nice proxy for that, right? Because you kind of put all those cards up in a virtual space. But it's a challenge, right? And getting those conversations to happen is a challenge, especially in COVID times. So these are things where we have to use a bit more time than we would have previously, and use the technology that we have available to us to try to get that alignment to happen.
Right. We have one comment here in terms of more like a technical question regarding this meeting here in terms of the microphone. I hear that as well. There's some disturbing sound there from time to time, but I'm not sure what it is. So apologies to the audience, but hopefully it's still audible. Hopefully that is not too disturbing.
Jeff, I was actually going to kind of come back to a point you brought up before, when you were starting to bring up it was around the discussion of the matrix, right? And basically kind of the siloing of data, basically. Like, so, you have all these different data sources, bringing it kind of back together in a consolidated way. And I just want to kind of turn the question from, let's say, we know that's challenging because of having it centralized, but I'm just thinking more of kind of like from a, let's say, delivery perspective, kind of more from the historic project data. And I mean, one of the things I love to always hack around about are like lessons learned, right? Or, when you're kind of putting together a plan, even this big room planning and stuff like that, if you've never done this type of implementation before, there's certain things that you might miss. And I mean, how can you integrate, like from a, let's say, Agile at scale or Agile perspective, how does this get integrated into, like, this historic project data get integrated into the actual planning processes, or like lessons learned, so that it's more efficient and effective, right? And it's,
Yeah, I mean, I would say, unfortunately, most organizations don't do a good job of incorporating historical data into their current project thinking. I've been in organizations where, there were several, well-known examples of catastrophic programs, or programs that had catastrophic failures, where after 18 months or 24 or 36 months, it was determined that the program wasn't going to be able to succeed, and they had to write off the entire investment. Happily, I wasn't involved in those programs, but these are kind of classic stories. Yet the organization continued to approve these large-scale programs with deliverables that only came at the end. And so to me, this is a kind of classic the psychological, this was something that's some kind of a behavioral phenomena where you're just not learning from the past. You're not, if you don't learn, what is it saying? If you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat yourself or something. And so these organizations just wouldn't learn. And to me, the lesson is very simple, right? The big, huge program should never be, that should never be your goal, is to deliver at the end of a 36-month program. Your goal should be to deliver in small increments. You always have to break the problem down. What's the smallest piece of that I can deliver, hopefully in 3 months at most, right? Or maybe in 6, but, so that's really where you can, or organizations can do themselves a big favor. You can have a 36-month vision, but you should be delivering that in 3-month increments, or maybe 6, but hopefully 2-week increments, right? So that you always have a shippable product, you always have value that's been delivered for the business, and your risk is minimized, right? If you think about these big programs as a giant ball of risk, that you're accumulating more and more risk as you go forward, if you're able to release incrementally, you continuously keeping your risk minimal as you go through. So I think that answers your question, but yeah.
It's going the direction. I mean, what I'm trying to kind of, when I think about it, a little bit further, we kind of, have set on our journey in ourselves, and we kind of look, and we, set up the meetup. And one of the kind of the fundamental points is when we look at like the project success rates, for example, of kind of just, technology projects or projects in general. I mean, they're actually relatively, kind of poor, right? I mean, my opinion, it's almost shockingly poor, right? And I mean, I think changing of methodologies or adoption of methodologies, et cetera, will help to a certain extent, right? But I mean, I'm just wondering, like, from your perspective, what would you consider like a successful project, right? If you say, I'm delivering a project, at the end of it, we're done, it was successful, or how would you measure that?
Yeah, great question, really. I mean, there's one overriding measure of success, and that's customer satisfaction, right? And you can go back to the Agile principles, right? The principles behind the Agile manifesto, and that is, the overriding thing is that we want to deliver something of value to our customers, and so that always has to be there. And I'll tell you, I've worked with a lot of organizations, and almost none of the organizations start off with when we walk in the door, start off with a measure of customer satisfaction. It's not there. And then when you look at programs that are set up, they usually are using output-based metrics. So, I have a program. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to deliver features. I'm trying to hit my milestones. But the features and the milestones are only a means to an end. So what the organizations typically don't do, maybe because it takes a bit more work, is focus on outcomes, right? So what is the outcome I'm trying to achieve with this piece of software or with this piece of functionality? Well, I want to have satisfied customers, and those customers could be external customers, end users, people that you're selling your products to. They might be internal customers. They might be the representative in a call center who's going to be using a system, and he or she would really benefit from having a system that's going to have the right information in front of them so that they can serve the customer better, they can have an easier experience, and life is better overall. So, the customer is anybody who's the end user of that system. In banking, we have some organizations, they produce reports that are then going to be brought to a regulator because the regulator needs to see what's going on in the bank. So the person, in my view, the end customer of that is the regulator is a customer, but the person who has to bring that report, has to explain that report, has to be able to communicate that information. They are also a really critical end customer. The easier you make it for that person to represent the data that the regulator or the auditor or whomever needs to see, then the better your product is, right? So there's always a customer at the end. Every system, no matter how many inter-system jumps you might have, ultimately there's an output that a human uses to do something, and that's your customer. And that person has to get benefit from that system, from that change, from that program as effectively as possible.
And I think it's kind of interesting because, like, a lot of the time, like in organizations, they focus heavily on the schedule, so on time, cost, kind of the
Yeah.
benefits. What was originally documented in the business case? Did we actually achieve that? And it's very interesting, right? And you don't actually see a lot of the customer experience on that. And I
Yeah.
mean, taking it one step further, I mean, we kind of look at it and always think of kind of the analytical approach of things, right? Like, is there a way, to improve the project success rates because they're relatively poor, right? But is there a way that we can make the journey to actually deliver this outcome better through, using analytics or, AI technologies or whatever? I mean, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, where do you maybe see like the areas where something like this could actually happen, like maybe from, let's say, use case kind of perspective or something like that?
Yeah, so I would say definitely if we bring together a bit of data on kind of our project success rate, our program success rate, or delivery success rate, you can look at data in terms of the metrics that I talked about before, your cycle time and your production defect rate, things like that. But you can then do like Monte Carlo simulations, for example, as maybe a kind of a very simplistic way of using machine learning AI types of techniques to look at, okay, if I ran this project or if I ran this program 1,000 times or 10,000 times, you know how long would it take me to deliver that? And I've seen stuff like that actually used in an agile context. But I think that you can use that, so for team estimations, right? But I think that you can use that same kind of a thing for projects and programs, and hopefully, inform an organization much more effectively about kind of where that actual, the realistic delivery date might be, right, for that kind of set of features and functionality. And then what are the risks that might then kind of be impacting on that, right? So I definitely see a need for, let's say, using the vast amount of data that we've got now at our fingertips and some of these powerful techniques that we've seen, right, that you have in common AI tools, to improve the predictive ability of the organization.
And it's actually kind of interesting because we had I think a meetup was one of our last ones where we actually ended up discussing about, with a couple colleagues from the UK, and it was a lot about, about kind of agile, if AI can kind of benefit and stuff like that. And kind of one of the things that come out of it is like, an organization has to have a data strategy. That you have to consolidate the data, and then you can start actually unlocking some of the potential, right? I think that was kind of the punchline of that one. And I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of take a step back and kind of think about it. I think there is, if you look at like these low success rates, and you think, we've adapted and changed methodologies over time, there has to be something else that we can do to improve it even more, right? And I think, going agile and bringing down, let's say the responsibility of the teams and changing the structure and working on the culture is very important. But on the other hand, I also think that, with the use, the data that's available, because, every project kind of has something similar with another project, right? It's not every single piece of work is absolutely unique, but I think there's a lot of value hidden in there. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Marcus, what you think about that topic.
Yeah, I had a question actually, and I would be interested to hear your view on this, Jeff, right? In terms of what you just mentioned, Nicholas, right, about the data and that we use obviously also to get better with the performance, get better with the planning. My question is, do you think that agile teams kind of that they have an advantage? Because I mean, you mentioned it before, right? In terms of tracking, you use a lot of metrics like cycle time and throughput and all kinds of burn down charts, etc. So you have a lot of data that you're producing for metrics, while in a traditional methods, they're obviously also like project controls, but not in that amount like in agile projects that's getting produced. Do you think like agile teams are kind of a step ahead in terms of or towards the data analytics driven or AI driven approach?
I think that they can be. I mean, partly depends on how the agile teams are working, right? I mean, in your most basic sense, your most basic agile is using sticky notes and sharpies, right? So if you're doing agile on a whiteboard or a corkboard or on a wall with sticky notes, then you don't necessarily have, let's say, I would say captured data, already captured data any more readily than anybody else. But if you're using tools like Jira and I don't want this to be an advertisement for Jira by any sense, but it's so commonly used. I mean, if you're using tools like that, then for sure there is a whole host of data that's already being captured about how you're working, right? And in most enterprises, you've got the Jira, you've got the ServiceNow system for the ticketing and things like that. So there is a really large amount of data that's available for the asking that you can bring in to then put into these kinds of intelligent systems to figure out where things are going well and where things maybe could be improved, right? And to give actionable insights to teams and to help them maybe spot that hidden gem of insight that they, even with all of their own, conversations, retrospectives, whatever, haven't been able to identify, right? Because after all, we're only human and we can only see the things in front of us. Sometimes it takes, with all this data, that kind of, that artificial view, that artificial intelligence scan of the vast amount of data to really pull that out.
I think, well, like you think about the amount of time, that is required to actually find all the relevant data that you could use in a decision or something. It's with the data volumes that are growing. I mean, it's relatively, for one human to do it and then at the end make a timely decision, right? It's almost, impossible, right? So you're almost going back to being forced to using experiences, to either identify what you think the problem is, and then you start already running off of, you start getting in this skewed manner of what's going on and making, maybe not the most optimal decision, right? Because it's all based on experience. But it is very interesting, right? I mean,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I certainly don't want to downplay the importance of good conversations and retrospectives and things like that, but at the same token, as you say, you can't keep all of that data in mind at one time, right? You don't know there's all the telemetry data about the products, and there's just too much going on with the kind of scale that we're working at, and being able to enhance. I think about it not as replacing tool, but enhancing the intelligence of the team, enhancing the intelligence of the leadership team, also with strong AI ML tools. Absolutely invaluable.
And that's actually an interesting point, because that just came back to my mind. I mean, if you think about the whole stakeholder component, right? Like if you're, like a sponsor or a senior manager, or you have a tech organization delivering, let's say, function product to you. I mean, to have this transparency of what realistic acceptance, I think is very valuable. Because if you've never actually delivered projects yourself, I mean, and you're a business guy, it's going to be relatively difficult to kind of understand how long is this going to take me? Is this approximately the right amount of money to allocate to something like this?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, right? Every company has a limited amount of resources, and there's only X amount of money that can be invested, right? Because you have to make the shareholders happy at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I have another question, just conscious of time. We have 6 minutes, I believe. I mean, when it comes to like transitioning to Agile is specifically at the end also going this further direction to something that's driven by data analytics or AI. Because I believe that many organizations, they struggle a little bit with adopting Agile practices because simply their structures, and comes also back to this organizational culture, it's basically not set up for this. And we always read like about Spotify and Netflix and these organizations which are basically born Agile, right? They started Agile from the very beginning, right? And there's no transitioning needed. But then you have these other organizations which are have established traditional structures, and then they try to become agile or data driven even, right? And they actually struggle then, right? I mean, my question is, how would you resolve that? I mean, apart from the organizational culture, these aspects, obviously, but what would you, and maybe you have experienced yourself when you work with your clients, how they actually can make that happen and come across those or come over those roadblocks?
Yeah. So it's a fantastic question. I mean, I would start by suggesting that, I mean, Spotify and Netflix, they weren't really born agile. They chose from the beginning to work in an agile way. And one of the things, if you do a little bit of research on Spotify, for example, a lot of people talk about the Spotify model, and I think they did an amazing service to the industry in the videos that they created back in 2012, 2013, something like that, right? Talking about the Spotify engineering culture and how they work. Amazing videos, really, really impactful. But now in 2021, the kind of running joke is that Spotify doesn't use the Spotify model. That is, I would say that they're a true agile organization, which means that you don't pick an organizational setup and a way of working and stick with that for time immemorial. You should be adapting, constantly improving, constantly trying something new to be more effective and to deliver better, to deliver for customers more effectively, right? So from that point of view, of course, yes, they are using the Spotify model, but they're not using the one that was in the videos back, almost a decade ago now, right? But that said, I think, organizations that have been working more traditionally, and the organizations that I worked for much of my career, do have a bit of a harder time to transition and to transform. And that's part of the reason why when we come to a lot of clients that are at this point where they've been doing some agile, but they can't really get to that next step. They can't take that big next step. And it really takes a strong top-down leadership commitment, right, from the top, because the teams can only do so much. And I've led these teams, and I've gotten, hundreds of engineers running in synchronized sprints and working off of common backlogs and really, enjoying life and engineering in big banks. But hitting that roadblock of not being able to be as effective as they want to be, as effective as they could be, right? We talk about maybe a kind of a two-speed IAT. I think like you're kind of running in second gear, but you're driving at 100 kilometers an hour in second gear. It's not sustainable over time. Your engine's going to blow out. And that's where leadership really needs to come in and say, okay, we're going to shift gears and turn the whole organization into an agile organization. And that has to come from the top. It can't, only so much can come up from the grassroots. And the grassroots being there is good, right? It's really valuable because then you have a basis on which to really then just kind of transform the rest of the organization. And you've proven that these certain kind of things, these methodologies, ways of working can function.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Just wondering if we still have some questions from the audience. So if there's any, please feel free to put it into the chat window. But I see we have only 1 minute left anyways. Is there anything else that you want to comment or
I have
highlight, Jeff?
a question for Jeff. If you could have a crystal ball, where would you see project management in 10 years?
Golly, a crystal ball. I don't know. I mean, what I would love to see is I would love to see, forget the crystal ball. I mean, who knows with the way things are today. I mean, I wouldn't have foreseen COVID a year and a half ago, right? So I won't try to make any predictions, but where I would like it to be is really to see a lot more data-driven decision making, a lot more. Obviously, I'm an agilist. I'm an agilist not because I've been, an agile consultant for years. I've been a practitioner for years, and I know that it works, and I know that everybody in the organization can live a better life, an easier life, a more productive life if they're working differently than they are today, right? And so I would just like to see a lot more organizations being top to bottom agile and using data-driven decision making, hopefully based on some kind of, clever algorithm that can drive estimations and drive progress toward delivering customer value.
Okay, that's
Cool.
good. That one as well.
Okay, we are at 7:30 here Zurich time, so I think it's time to wrap up. I mean, first of all, thank you very much, Jeff, for
Thank you guys for having me.
having you here as a guest. I hope that was also useful for the audience. If there are any follow-up questions, the recording will be on YouTube. Feel free to comment there, and maybe Jeff, you can then even answer if that's possible. And yeah, we hope to have our next meetup then next month. So thanks again, Jeff, and thanks for everyone attending here today. And from my side, have a good evening.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Nicholas.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye bye.
Take care.